Hello, deviants. Wait, I did say in my last video that I'd be taking a little bit of time because I was burned out. I'm still burned out, but now I've been kind of bulling. I've been super happy and stoked to be doing what I'm doing. I've been working really hard on a bunch of other projects, and I've been really happy with that. I've been taking my time and enjoying myself, and yeah, as I said in my last video, the last series took an awful lot out of me, so I wanted this one to, or at least whatever I did next, to be a lot more patient, kind on myself as far as workload stuff goes and all of that. Today, I have asked my Discord server, which if you support me on Patreon, you get access to my Discord server. I asked people about their general questions that they would ask me about the writing process. So if you don't know, which you would have to be living under a rock if you have watched many of my videos and didn't know this, but I wrote a book. It's called Fluids. This that I'm holding in my hand is the very last signed first edition copy. First year of this book being published. I mean, we're coming up on a year in March. I have not been able to obtain a copy for myself. This is my personal copy. I actually have a personal copy now. Shit has sold out. There might be more soon. I'm not exactly sure. We have moved 5,000 of these. 5,000 people have bought this book. From the reaction that I've been gauging, and I do really genuinely care about the reaction to the book. I listen to a lot of criticism about it. I listen to a lot of stuff. People generally tell me that I'm fairly good at writing, which is a piece of news for me. I did not actually know that I was good at writing, but now I guess I do. And so I figured I would ask my Discord server, are there questions that you have about the process? Because I know that a lot of people at home are creative people. They're artists and they like making stuff. They don't necessarily have the answers that maybe they want. I'm not necessarily saying that I'm the kind of person that knows everything. Matter of fact, I would argue that I don't know that much. From the actual tangible writing to the editing to it actually getting out into the world and then selling fairly well for an indie writer, I figure there's probably a couple things that I know that could be helpful for people that are just getting started or people that have been writing for years. And this is why I specifically asked Discord for questions that people would think were relevant. This is going to be some general writing advice. We're going to go right into it. Keep in mind that we can always do this again. If you have any specific question, feel free to ask me in the comments or head over to my Patreon Discord server and we can just talk there. Here we go. So the first question is, what are your favorite research methods? And is it different with fiction versus videos? So with video stuff, like I've done prior, the research method is usually sourcing. The way that I like to write video stuff is by getting as many thoughts and opinions as I possibly can and then sort of parsing out what I actually think about those opinions and those thoughts. I do read a lot, so a lot of my mentality on all of this comes from the physical reading that I do. And so that's what happens for videos. I also am a big fan of rumors. Playing with rumors is a fun thing for me in videos. So a lot of times people will say something you said is factually incorrect in a video, which may be true. But also I enjoy the concept of interrogating a rumor that I've heard all over the fucking internet or through personal relationships, friends, and making that more of the focus almost than just telling you what you may already know about a subject. So that's an element to my writing as far as video research goes. I would say my fiction writing is almost entirely dependent on my personal experiences. I think that a lot of people would say that. I think a lot of writers would say that they try to experience a swath of things, elements of their life, and more or less they're trying to communicate these elements that people may or may not actually know about some dimensions of life. I've just spilled coffee on myself. My mentality is entirely dependent on that. And that is my bottom line, is trying to tell not necessarily my story, but stories that I have personally interacted with. So a lot of people would say, well, May, Fluids is one of the most disgusting books I've ever read. Would you say that any of that is somehow in line with your personal experience? And that might be horrifying. But also, yes, I do know people like my characters, Lauren and Dahlia. And the same is true for my follow-up book, which I will be announcing at the end, but characters in that one as well, Caroline and Angie. And they're both people that I feel like I personally know, or I have experienced the dimension of life that they're going through. Like Fluids for me is very much about the dichotomy between choosing to like live and bloom or choosing nihilism and just to die. Experienced myself having done a lot of the work that I've done in my life and a lot of the research, these things end up becoming an enormous part of what motivates me to write, because at that point I'm telling my story or the story of people that I love. Where or how do you start writing a new project? I have so many ideas for short stories, but can never figure out how to actually get going with writing. The hardest thing in the world, and I know everybody says this, but it's the blank page. Like typically, if you begin writing words, then you'll find that it's fairly easy to continue writing words. It's just hard to begin. And so typically what I like to do with writing a project, like starting a new writing project, is I'll just pick a word that I feel like represents a feeling that I'm like experiencing in some sort of significant way. And I'll just write that word on the page and then I'll just stare at it. And usually like if I stare at it long enough, a story just kind of unfolds around it. The most important part is always just having a word on the page, because if there's a word on the page, it's not blank. If it's not blank, then it's not necessarily as intimidating. You can always delete the word later. I'll usually just start with a word, a sentence, a vibe, like just throw a bunch of stuff on a page, and then I'll start looking at it and thinking about it. And then that has a tendency to inform a lot of what ends up becoming the story. Like stories exist in two ways. And ultimately, a lot of people talk about how they want to have written a book, but ultimately what we're talking about is stories. Stories are the currency. You're trying to tell a story, and telling a story from scratch is not an easy act. You know, a lot of people talk about how much they want to write, but don't actually do it. The other thing is true where there are hundreds of thousands of pieces of literature that exist. Lots of people publish every single year. There really is nothing holding anybody back. It's just about like figuring out how to get yourself to put the words on the page and see where they take you. A lot of people talk about, strict outlining, and we'll talk about that later. I personally find that a lot of those things come to a detriment because they prevent me from actually just writing words on a page. Whenever I'm doing a first draft, which I often call my first drafts vomit drafts, without judgment, I am going to puke out every imaginable word that I can think of that associates with the theme that I have begun working with. Work on that later and make that kind of crafted into something more significant. But at first, it has to just be trash. And you have to be okay with it being trash. I like trash. These are the ways that I personally get over the motivational hurdle. I write a lot. Over the course of the last year, when I was working post Fluids, I was thinking, a lot about what I wanted my follow-up book to be. So I wrote 1 million starts to 1 million stories until I found the story that was just like, this is the story I want to tell. That came a lot of times from just starting to write about vibes, starting to write words, just general words, and going from there. Many, many not blank pages that I could always dive into and make that something at any point. How do you stay motivated to complete the entire process? Okay, this one is very important in my opinion because a lot of people think that they're done when they've written a first draft. Typically for me, I finish out a first draft at about 40,000 words, 45,000 words. That looks pretty significant when you're staring down all the time that it takes to get all those words on a page. If you break a chapter down, for instance, into microcosm, this is something I was kind of saying where writing exists as a macrocosm, we're thinking of a book or a legacy or a lineage, a series, something like that, versus just a word or just a page or just a chapter. I find that I'm a lot more motivated to finish a chapter than I am to finish a whole book. A whole book is very intimidating, but I think well, if I can write a chapter about something, then maybe we're on to something. I finish a first draft at about 40,000 words, and then I give it about a week or 2 weeks. A friend of mine once told me that the best way to handle this is you take your wonderful manuscript and you stick it in the drawer. Like, imagine a metaphysical, metaphorical even drawer, like in a desk. You take that and you just shove it in the desk. You don't look at it. You don't touch it. You don't think about it. And then when you pull it out in 2 weeks, you just read it. And as you're reading it, you're going to start to think, well, what do I want from this? Is this a story that feels like right to me? That's when you start to get new words and new ideas, and you start to firm up a lot of the things that make it significant for you. I know a lot of writers have this process where they like to start a new story, write a first draft, put it in a drawer, and then immediately start another book and just write that first draft. And when they're done with that one, then they'll pull the one out of the drawer and start looking at it, because it kind of gives you perspective. Writing is very much something you have to practice, and I know that sounds kind of intimidating because it means that, maybe your first draft isn't going to be very good, but nobody's first draft is very good. I did 6 drafts of Fluids before I was happy with it. 3 on my new one. I got to where I needed to be a lot faster, but there's still a lot of things where I'm ironing it out and I'm taking my time to do that. But it's not just about time, it's also about space. So when it comes to being motivated to complete the entire process, first you have to have something. And then once you have something, no matter how insignificant it is, you can start to bolster it and work on it, tighten it up, think about it in new ways, add new life experiences and things like that to it. And eventually it starts to flesh itself out and become something more significant. And so the editing process for me is largely asking myself, like, what do I want from this? What do I not want from this? And I don't hand it to an actual physical editor until I feel like I'm at least perfectly content with the story. There are 2 kinds of edits. There are the grammatical and the developmental, trying to make the story right. I do all my own developmental editing because it saves me a lot of time and a lot of money. Genuinely believe that in most circumstances, when you're writing something specifically as extreme as fucking Fluids ended up being, need to trust that you may know more about it than other people. But I also try to get a lot of other people's opinions along the way. I feel like those people will understand the general ideas so that we can just talk about the story. So the motivation to finish a project is knowing that there's a core of something that's true or good about a project, and knowing you want to take it to those final stages, but it does take a lot of work in the editing process. I spend way more time editing than I spend actually writing. I think everybody says this. Craft something, really interrogate something, show it to some people, get a general ishness on how it feels, do a couple more passes on your own, read it on your own, think about it. Sometimes it's good to have somebody else read it to you. Am I using certain words way too much? How do we feel about this chapter to chapter, but also as a whole? And then at the end of it, you start to feel like, okay, this story is really coming together. And then once it really comes together, then I'll usually pass it off to an editor. They'll take a pass at it. And if I'm happy with it, then it's time to move on to publishing. And there you go. You've finished the process. It's not as hard as it seems. It's just tedious. It isn't tedious if you really care about having that story told. You have to, in your head, be like, it's important that I tell this story. If you remember that it's important to tell that story, you won't ever get bogged down by whether or not you're going to finish it. How do you overcome the feeling that your art is invalid because it is self-centered? All art is self-centered, but also most things under capitalism, for instance, are self-centered as well. It's well, how do you go into work every day knowing that it's self-centered? Well, you just have to, and so in a lot of ways, instead of thinking oh my God, why would I think anyone would read me? What do I, oh, you don't have the right. Oh, you don't have the right. Oh, you don't have the right. The reason that people go into their day jobs is so that they can pay their rent, so that they can buy food. Taking the plunge into spending this amount of time on a creative project often comes down to being okay, I've got to pay for food. I've got to, pay my rent. And if I think about it like that, then it's like a day job. I go in, I put in my time, give it a lot of thought, and then I'm not worried about it being self-centered because it's not self-centered. It's simply not. I mean, we're talking about, putting voice to universal feelings. And that's what a lot of the best writers in history have done. This is why books connect with people. You're trying to demonstrate something that is universally true. How can that be self-centered? Curious about how you go about making and fleshing out characters. This is very similar to the process that I was talking about with story editing. Give it 3 chapters or so of just writing. I call it taking a character for a walk, letting a character be in their natural habitat, work through some minor problem, and then through that minor problem, I typically learn what is true of that character, parse out what about that character definite and well-defined, and then through that, I start to bolster those aspects and diminish the aspects that I feel like are less interesting. Most characters are just people, and most people have a story. In the mind of the people that are living that story, it is important. So in a lot of ways, it's about identifying what about their life they're struggling with versus what about their life do they enjoy, and putting those two things at odds and seeing what happens. I feel like this is the internal conflict of every human being. So that's typically where I start. Go through a couple chapters of just taking them for a walk, letting them live and see how that feels. And then usually I'll go back and start to ask myself, what does that all mean? What does it mean to be that person? And what kind of story does that person live out? There are things that they personally are interacting with. There's a lot of things that happen to us. We choose to interact with the things that happen to us, and those things typically become the story. I look at that as way more valuable than a hero's journey arc or something like that. It's way more about a personal arc, the way that a character themselves chooses to bloom in the ways that they bloom, or chooses to fall into their own demise in their own way. The meat of a character. Which authors or writers do you get inspiration from? So I told you I read a lot, and I do read a lot. I read a lot of modern literature, contemporary stuff that's coming out now, and I also read a lot of historical literature. I read Jane Eyre a couple months ago, and I really loved it. Things like that. So it's important to, I feel, read classic literature for the very specific purpose that these are stories that connected with people and continue to connect with people throughout time. What are the elements of that are so human? A lot of people treat Shakespeare like it's high art, but the reality of Shakespeare is that it's human. It's stories that a lot of people have experienced themselves personally, and they love seeing that story portrayed in literature. So things that are bite size often help too. Short stories are good. So it's hard for me to pinpoint anybody in specific because I believe you should probably be trying to read everything. Don't stop reading. Read everything. Read articles. Read what people are saying about other books that are coming out from your contemporaries, because that's going to gauge the reaction of connectivity versus a lack of connectivity. Ultimately, we want our books to connect with people. And in order for them to connect with people, we have to know what elements of our life right now are the things that we want told. I don't feel like other writers necessarily inspire me, if that makes sense. Ideas inspire me. When it comes to writing, I don't sit down and go, I would like to write a book like Duncan Ralston. I don't do that. I want to write a book about love, or I want to write a book about blooming, or I want to write a book about misery, And those ideas end up usually fueling me a lot more than me going I love House of Leaves. It's time for me to write my House of Leaves, because you're never going to do that. And you're just going to hate it because it's not going to be House of Leaves. It's going to be your lame attempt to do the same thing that's already existed. It's important to read House of Leaves. I'm not saying don't read it. There are elements of yourself that you want to see in literature. Find those. Those inspire me way more than the writings of other people, although I do really strongly believe that you should be reading everything you can. When approaching horror, do you prefer writing about the grotesque or the uncanny? I feel like this question is limited because I think that putting horror stories in the dichotomy of grotesque or uncanny is almost it's like a non-starter for me. Some of my writing is grotesque, and yes, some of my writing is uncanny. Those things don't excite me so much as writing something stark. I'm concerned about what's true. Living life and knowing life means that you have to know everything about life, and in a lot of ways, horror is a reflection of the things we don't want to have to deal with in our life. Something mundane can be just as grotesque as something violent. That in and of itself, I believe, is a stark truism. So because it's so stark, like that ends up motivating me to write about that. I don't really like to consider, am I going to write something grotesque or something uncanny? I typically am more thinking like, okay, I want to write something that's true. And if it ends up being grotesque or it ends up being uncanny, cool. But also I like multi-tonality. I don't like picking. I've never liked picking. I'm also a musician. I made this earlier this year, and I have another one coming out in a couple months, but I make a lot of music. So clearly multi-tonality is important to me. I like writing, but I also like writing music, I like doing a lot of things. So I'm never the kind of person to pick, but I do want to do something true, and I want to do something that connects with people because it's true. I think that that's far more important than doing something that scares people. I feel like reality scares people. So if you write about reality, then you're going to scare people. There's no way around that. How do you work through a creative block? Well, this one's difficult for me because I don't get giant creative blocks. I get frustrations. So I feel like a creative block is usually massaged out by simply writing something. Even if it sucks and you don't like it, you can just delete it. It's, if you judge yourself, yeah, you're going to run into a lot of creative blocks. But if you treat yourself like a dumb little kid in a candy store and you just want to have all the candy in the store, then it's hard to be creatively blocked. You're just filling your bag with goodies. There's a billion goodies. You just have to grab one and see where it takes you, see what it tastes like. I do have petty frustrations. So I'll realize something about a story. I'll be like, okay, I like this part of the story, but I'm going to have to go back into the story somewhere in, start the conversation that would lead to this great part of the story. And in order to do that, that feels frustrating sometimes because you're talking about working something in that's unnatural into something that's already very naturally paced. That is frustrating for me. I never really get blocked up about that. It's more just I get frustrated and then I take some time off. Go hang out with your girlfriend, go play some Bloodborne, go smoke some doink, and come back to it tomorrow. Just ruminate on it. It takes a long time to become wine. You gotta let that shit ruminate in order for it to become wine. The wine will come, but you have to let it ferment a little bit. Are you an outline person or a figure it out in my head as we go along kind of person? I hate outlines. I can openly say that outlines are the death of my creativity. I don't like rules. I don't like plans because those things feel like more of a hindrance to me than anything. So I'm not necessarily a figure it out in my head as we go kind of person. I'm more of a take it for a walk kind of person. Let's extrapolate this out and see what would naturally happen if I just let my brain pretend that I'm this character and see where they go. Then I start to outline something that resembles movement or action, and then I'll think to myself, okay, how do I structure this in a way that it works on a narrative level? Where do I want these beats to land? How much more do I need to put in there? And then I'll typically start writing extensive notes. I take extensive notes on my writing. Definitely not an outline person, but I am a huge advocate for extensive notes, and you must follow your notes. How did you manage writing about such extreme and taboo subject matter as you have in Fluids? So if you don't know this, Fluids is an extreme horror novel. I wanted to write a book that the bad stuff that I've seen in Guro or the bad stuff that I've seen in fucked up movies and stuff like that. I wanted to tell a story like that would genuinely kind of compete with a story that's as fucked up as one of those, I guess is what I was trying to do. I already had it in my head. I want this to go really wrong. If I give a character a problem and then I let that problem fester long enough, they'll get desperate about their problem. And if they get desperate about it, they'll probably do something extreme to get what they want. And so I was thinking, like, it's character motivation. It's not about me. It's not necessarily about the way that I feel. It's the way the character feels. And it's fun for me to enter the perspective of somebody that's not me and then see where they go. I don't have any qualms necessarily with having written an extreme horror novel. Like, it's not like it affected me or that my brain is fucked up. I wanted to investigate the kind of person that would do something awful and why they would do something awful. Reverse engineer, okay, I want them to do something awful, but in order for them to do that, they need to get desperate. And in order for them to be desperate, they need to want something really badly. When you feel like you need something, you start to do things that are kind of wild. So I figured that was the way I would do that. A lot of the things in the book are taboo. They're taboo for me having written them. They're taboo for them to be literally written down on a page for people to read, but they're extreme choices. The thing that I always go back to is like, freak it. You want bold choices. So if you're making bold choices, you usually feel great about yourself because you're like, damn, I wrote something bold. You're not really thinking, damn, I'm a fucked up person for having written this. I know how to write characters, but not how to write stories. Any advice? Go where your characters go. I think characters in and of themselves want to tell their own stories. So let them. Just ask yourself, well, what scenario would this person find themselves in that would constitute a story? Stories don't have to be that complicated. They don't have to be that wild. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's like extremely slice of life, and we're talking about their day to day, and those in and of themselves make up stories. What's going to happen next? That in and of itself is the writing a story part. And I think that comes naturally. I think people are just usually blocked off by their ideas of the concept of story. But story comes and then it gets refined. Give birth to them, let them live and see where it takes them. And then once you're done with that, you're going to find that you have a draft pretty quickly. And if you don't like the story when you've got it in a draft, write some notes and work on it. In my brain, it's pretty straightforward. Stories are not necessarily hard. Getting stories right is hard. Do you listen to music while you write? Absolutely not. I cannot focus on two things at the same time. I typically will put myself in an environment where something's going on, that is completely unrelated. Like somebody in the background is watching TV, somebody is washing the dishes, or they're doing their laundry, or that in and of itself will kind of build the soundscape for me to write something. Putting headphones on and listening to music distracts me, and then I don't get any writing done. Did you write a lot before Fluids? Well, certainly I did. I mean, you don't get a book apropos of nothing. I've been writing since I was like a child. I've always been interested in the written word. I think you have to be interested in the written word to want to have written something. I've been writing on YouTube for the last goddamn decade, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a requirement. Anybody can start writing at any moment and call that a party. Like, go for it. Writing is about practice, and you do have to practice. Like, you have to find reasons to write things. Like, sometimes when I'm holed up, like, and I can't seem to figure out what I want to write about today, I will just write something unrelated. Just write about a piece of music you heard that you liked. Write about a movie, your morning coffee and how you felt about it. Write about what you see when you look out the window. Write about your girlfriend. You know what I mean? Write about something that's like right there. And then soon you'll find that those things end up informing your writing more than the writing you intended to do. What is the most difficult part of the writing process for you personally, and how do you overcome it? The hardest part of writing for me is editing. And it's not editing in the early stages, it's editing in the late stages. You start to ask yourself, well, what am I intending here? I have to be able to see all the themes that I've got, make sure that my ending, which is always the hardest part, getting the ending right usually means culminating all of your themes. And, one of my big problems is usually I'll write a body of like 40K words or something, and then by the end of it, it'll be like 60, 65. I'll have a great 2/3 of it. But the first chapter is usually weak, and the last like 5 chapters are usually weak. And the reasoning for that is typically because like it takes a lot to culminate all of your themes together in a way that's perfect. Firm believer that I don't want my writing to be good. I want my writing to be correct. I want people to read it and go, of course. If I can do that, then I believe that I've done a good job. The hardest part is always making sure that you've got your ending right and you've got the very first chapter right. Consider them like thesis statements. You want to make sure and get all of your themes down in both portions, and then you want to build those themes up in a way that feels natural and fluid and human. If it leaves a sour taste, it's usually not the right choice for me. What if we only have one honest story inside ourselves to tell? I feel like that is one of those things that you would say if you don't write a lot. There are a billion stories. There are so many stories happening literally every day. Your life is a story. My life is a story. Everybody I know's life is a story, and they're living it out right now. And there are things they're afraid of. There's conflict always in everybody's life. And these are all stories. You need to learn to be aware of the fact that there are other stories. A big portion of writing is about empathy, feeling for someone who isn't you. In order to feel for someone who isn't you, you have to pay attention. I find myself paying attention to other people's stories and asking myself, like, well, how are they going to live out their story? And if I can get a decent read on how they're living out their story, then it's fairly easy for me to think about my own stories and my own characters and how I want them to live out their stories. So we don't just have one story. Nobody has one story. Your life is made up of hundreds of stories. And so you can tell one, or you can tell the one that you're going to go through next year, or you can tell the one that you went through last year. There's a million stories in your life, and there's a million stories that everybody's going through. Do you have any advice about taking self-imposed deadlines seriously, or just the ways to increase the pressure on yourself to get work done? I think pressure is the death of art. I hate deadlines and I hate pressure. Typically what I'll do is I'll kind of throw a dart in my brain and I'll be like, I want this to come out in March. If I want it to come out in March, then I'll usually be like, well, okay. That means that I need to probably have something that resembles kind of ready in the next month. I have a new book that's coming out soon. It's called Girl Flesh, and I've been writing it for the last year. I have thrown a dart in my brain and I've said that I would like it to come out in February or March. Realistically, if it ends up coming out in April or May, I'm not going to cry about it. I'm going to be fucking hunky-dory that the book is out. So I have no pressure on myself. I just have a nice little estimate of a landing time. And if I'm a little bit delayed, then I'm a little bit delayed. If I'm a little early, I'm a little early. But pressure is not the way. Give yourself space. Give yourself time. Be empathetic to yourself. Self-empathy is good. Understand where you're coming from and understand that your perspective is limited. The things you know today are not necessarily going to be the things you know tomorrow, and you're going to learn more about yourself and your own story as time passes. So get ready for those things to change. If that's true, then a self-imposed deadline is not going to work for you, and it usually doesn't work for anybody. I don't know anybody who's like, yes, I'm so glad that I have this haunting thing in my head knowing that I have to get this shit done in 6 weeks. That shit's the death of you. That'll fucking kill you. That'll make you go insane. So don't do that. If you do have a deadline and you're working with a deadline, because that is something that happens, sometimes if you're working with a publisher's like, we need that shit in a month. If that's what you're doing, then the best way to handle that is by giving yourself freedom from judgment. Write some words. And if they're shitty words, they're shitty words. You can always fix them. It's not like you're going to spend a year regretting them. Just fix them. Just work on them. See where it takes you. What drugs should one do while writing? There's a George Carlin bit where he's like, write your funny stuff when you're high and then and punch up when you're drunk or high. Edit sober. I think the other thing is write drunk, edit sober. A lot of times the reason people are saying that is because they're trying to remove judgment on their first draft and then reapply judgment when they're trying to think critically. I don't necessarily use drugs while writing. I don't think that it's the most helpful. If that's what you must do, do as thou wilt. If you're going to do drugs, do them to experience the world. Do them to experience things and understand dimensions of life that you may not understand. Don't do them to get yourself to work. Because drugs and work do not go together well. How do you approach more difficult subject matter when writing? How do you write about things that are controversial and traumatic without being tactless or performative. I'm gonna be a fucking chump here and say, as Shakespeare once said, all life is a stage, or all the world is a stage. We're always performing. We're always being kind of tactless about stuff. And, there isn't necessarily a way to write something perfectly responsible or perfectly respectful. A lot of writing is just inherently problematic. A lot of times you're writing about people going through some of the worst things that have ever happened. So you kind of have to give yourself the nuance to understand that the things your characters are saying, thinking, and doing are going to be performative. And they're also going to be tactless. They're going to be wrong. And it's about having the awareness enough to realize when you're doing that. Also know when you're doing it and when your characters are doing it. Some of the editing process it's not necessarily for me. I don't ever think in my head like, oh God, if I write this, I'm going to be canceled. I don't really think about that. Is this character a good person? If they're not a good person, then let them be a shitty person. They need to be a shitty person. And it sucks to have to be that person when you're typing it, but also have the emotional distance to know that the things you're saying are not necessarily the things you believe. If you're performing a character, don't let yourself not perform, but also understand you're going to be tactless. But a lot of those things get ironed out in editing and letting friends read and letting trusted people help you. It's like self-fulfilling. It answers itself. A lot of people want writing to be bad. They want writing to be tactless. They go into literature to experience bad people or people that they don't necessarily agree with. The biggest demographic for true crime is soccer moms. People of a middle age are desiring in droves problematic text. They want that shit. There's nothing wrong with giving them what they want. If you personally are being shitty on literature, that's something that you personally have to deal with, and you have to deal with the consequences that come with that. But that doesn't necessarily mean you should stop yourself from talking about the harder elements of being alive, because a lot of people want to hear about that. There is no safe place for people to hear about the things they don't want to know about being alive. Tell them. It's okay to tell them. No one's going to get mad at you. What do you find most helpful from constructive criticism, and how do you balance out criticism with your own goals? I take everything with a grain of salt, because I know that if I'm sharing a piece of literature that I've written with somebody that I love or I care about their opinion, they love what I'm doing as much as I love what I'm doing. Whatever they're saying is probably true. Don't get sensitive. Never get sensitive. Never, ever, 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 ever take something somebody said and get offended about it, because you asked. You asked. If you put it out into the world, then you said to yourself, this fulfills my goals. And if it doesn't work for some people, sometimes people don't connect with the things you're saying. This is fine. Sometimes people want things from you that you personally are not doing or are not interested in doing or don't care about doing, and that's okay too. But when it comes to somebody you love and trust being like, hey, I feel like the ending of your story is maybe defeating the point of the entire rest of the story, here's how, you should listen to that person. You should listen to that person, and you should take notes, and you should smile. You should be happy that that person took the time to tell you. There's an intimidation to the fact that you wrote a big piece of literature. When somebody gets that and they actually read it and they have qualms with it, they gave you enough respect to actually sit down with you and read that. They're probably right, and they're probably being honest with you. Accept their honesty and understand that their honesty is respect. And them respecting you means you should let them read what you're working on, and you should listen to them. How do you figure out pacing for your writing? Pacing is natural. Pacing is intuitive. Pacing is something that you, inside your own mind and heart, know this is too long or this is too short. And also constructive criticism, when you let somebody read it or you read it out loud to yourself, a lot of times you're like, geez, I sure am just hammering on the same nail for goddamn hours. And at that point, it's very, very easy to be like, okay, here's stuff that I want to remove, or here's stuff that I want to change. So the way that I handle bad pacing is I'll typically identify when I've been hammering on a nail for too long, and I'll be like, okay, I have two options. I can either cut this, and people are afraid to cut their writing because they're like, I wrote it, it's precious. It's not. They're just words. You can always write new ones, and you also need to realize that not all words are good and not all words need to be in your book. Your book does not have to fulfill a quota of words. You can remove words and add words all you want. So figuring out pacing can come down to removing those words or finding a creative and new way to express the scene or the thing you're talking about. If the way that you're talking about it feels like it's hammering on a nail for a long time, it probably is. You probably need to figure out a new creative solution to making that bit of the book engaging. If you want to keep the words, if you think that the pace is correct, then consider finding new creative avenues to make that writing click. Pacing is usually solved with creativity, or it's solved with diminishing. Pull it back or bolster it in a way that is new and fresh and it feels like it's good. Something that I personally believe is that every part of a book should be your favorite fucking part. There shouldn't be one part of the book where you're like, this is not my favorite scene. If there's a part in the book where you're like, then it's bad, get rid of it or change it or bolster it. Make it your favorite part of the book. If that part of the book is not your favorite, you need to make it your favorite. Every part of your book should be as strong as the other parts, and if it isn't, that's where you're having problems. This has been the list of questions that I got this round. If people want me to do this again and talk more at length about writing, I will do so. Very briefly at the end here, a couple things. I have a new album coming out in February or March. I'm still figuring out the dates, but I have a single. It's on Spotify and it's currently blowing the fuck up. So that's great. People seem to like the single. Love that for me. The album is called Angel Grind. I've been working on it for most of the last year, and I was working on it somewhat simultaneously with Neopets, which is out on physical now. You can buy these CDs. I have a big sale going on my Bandcamp for a little while where all my CDs are $5. You can get these for $5 now. You can get all my CDs for $5. So if you want one, I'll ship you one for $5. The second thing is Fluids is out of print on its first run. The first edition is gone. It's done. It's gone. You cannot get it anymore. However, the second edition is available in unlimited copies. I have so many of them. And there is about to be a third edition, which is the same front cover as the first edition. The second edition has a dead bird on it, and a lot of people were a little bit irked by that. I don't care. I like it. This original cover is going to be on the third edition. It's going to be available on my Bandcamp. I am going to run a little promotion probably whenever I get them from the printer, where I'm going to do 50 signed copies. I haven't started pre-orders or anything like that for those, but if you're interested in picking up my book, please do. Support your local writer. I love writing more than I love pretty much any other art. I would like to be a writer and that be my thing. I care about that a lot. Well, as well as music. But if you're going to support me at this point, buy my book. Read my book. It's on Kindle. It's on Amazon. It's on my Bandcamp. You can buy it on my Bandcamp. There will be links in the description for you to do that. I do want to announce that I have written a second book. It's called Girl Flesh. I think that it is better than Fluids by a lot. And it's probably going to be available in the next month or two, depending on how the next couple drafts go. As I said, I don't like deadlines and I don't like being rushed, but I feel pretty confident announcing it now because I am in the final stages. I haven't sent it to my editor yet because there are still 2 or 3 bits in the book that I'm still ironing out. But as soon as those get ironed out, that bitch is done. The book is about 2 women who go on a really, really scary road trip. Some would say that Fluids is also that, but Girl Flesh is very inspired by stuff like Wild at Heart. I was reading a lot of stuff like that, but it's also a book about love. It's a book about lesbians. Everybody likes lesbians. It's a book about dealing with the horrors of the world, especially with a partner and knowing that you love someone in the midst of a world that's really cruel. These are the things that I've been really thinking about lately. I'm really proud of it. I think that it's going to be really great. I think a lot of people are going to connect with it. So I'm really excited to see how that reaction kind of plays out with other human beings other than myself. I love the book personally and think it's some of the best work I've ever made. Yeah, as soon as I get a couple things ironed out, that thing's going to my editor. And then once it hits my editor, it's not going to be long until that thing is ready for publication. As of right now, I'm going to be releasing it indie, just like I did with Fluids, because that model worked for me. As I said, I sold 5,000 copies. I was also in Newsweek for this, like this month. If you go pick up a Newsweek, a physical Newsweek, and you'll see my book cover in that fucking magazine. It's crazy. So I think going indie works for me. I like doing indie stuff, but I'm also open to the idea of publishing with like a real publisher that's really significant. But also, I just like releasing my own stuff. Like, I like being in control of my own supply and demand, to be able to name my price, and I don't charge very much for my books, and I like that. I don't want to charge more. We'll see what happens with that, but as of right now, like, I'm not looking for any serious offers unless I got one that I actually liked. But one way or another, that book's going to be in your hands, or at least available for pre-order sometime in the next couple months. So keep an eye out for that. If you don't follow me on Instagram, I guess Twitter is dead, but you can also follow me there. I will be posting about this like significantly over the next couple of months, and everybody's going to have to endure me talking about it for the remainder of my life. So get ready for that. I am really proud of it. I do think that people are going to really connect with it. I hope. But once again, I've been May Leitz, human being, writer, musician, person. Thank you for watching, and consider supporting me on Patreon if you like my work and you care about what I'm doing. Also, as soon as Girl Flesh is published, there will be an ebook going out to all my patrons, just like I did for Fluid. So get hyped for that, I guess. Thank you so much for watching. If you do want me to do more stuff like this, I happily will. If you want me to do one for music stuff, I can also do that. I don't know. I like sharing the knowledge that I've accrued with my audience. I think that it's good to get knowledge out there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Like and subscribe. Wow, that felt stupid.
Thank you.